Everything began when a group of mutineers, fleeing from the British military and searching for a place where they could hide from the rest of the world, arrived on this island. But in reality, the story goes back much further than them. This tiny island would witness countless tragedies, rebellions, deaths, and unbelievable events over the centuries. The Polynesians, who eventually vanished from history, arrived on this island around the 11th century and established a settlement here. Together with the animals they brought with them, they began building a new life. At that time, the island possessed extremely valuable resources. In particular, its obsidian deposits and high-quality stone reserves provided significant advantages for the people living there. Moreover, the island was not only rich in resources, but also highly suitable for survival. Fertile soil, fresh water sources, and favorable seasons allowed its inhabitants to live comfortably. They traded the resources they extracted with the people of Mangareva Island, located roughly 500 kilometers away, and maintained their economy through this exchange. If you take a look at a map, it immediately becomes clear just how isolated this island was. It was one of the most difficult places in the world to reach. For the first settlers, however, this isolation was not a disadvantage. It was a blessing. They most likely raised livestock, farmed the land, mined valuable materials, and improved their lives through trade. This way of life continued without major problems for nearly 400 years. But as with all good things, their prosperity could not last forever. As the centuries passed, the island's natural resources gradually began to run out. Once their most valuable trade goods disappeared, their relationship with Mangareva started to weaken as well. Simply put, they no longer had anything valuable left to exchange. First, trade declined, then poverty arrived, and eventually, peace disappeared. As resources became scarce, tensions between people began to rise. The communities living on this tiny island became increasingly hostile toward one another. Scarcity, hunger, and uncertainty fueled their anger. The moment the first blood was spilled, the beginning of the end had already arrived. The Polynesians found themselves fighting scarcity while also facing another harsh reality. Escape was impossible. There was nowhere else to go. They were trying to survive in the middle of the ocean, isolated from the rest of the world. As the years passed, the population began to decline. People died from hunger, others died in conflicts. Eventually, the island that had once been full of life and prosperity fell completely silent. Life on the island had come to an end. Nothing could be heard except the sound of the wind. And so the island remained abandoned, left to its fate for many years. A very long time passed after these events. Then, in 1787, the second and much darker chapter of this story began. Britain sent a ship called the Bounty into the Pacific Ocean. Its mission was relatively simple: find breadfruit plants and transport their seeds back to British territories. At the time, Britain controlled major colonies throughout the Caribbean. Feeding the people living in those colonies required a cheap and efficient food source, and breadfruit seemed like the perfect solution. For that reason, the crew of the Bounty embarked on a long and difficult journey. Their plan was to travel across the Pacific Islands, collect the plants they needed, and establish a new agricultural project for the British Empire. What nobody realized at the time was that this voyage would eventually become one of the most famous mutinies in history. The Bounty's journey began exactly as planned. The crew traveled between islands throughout the Pacific carrying out their mission. But everything changed when the ship arrived at Tahiti, because most of these sailors had never seen a place like it in their entire lives. Imagine spending months aboard a cramped ship. You receive orders every day. You battle storms. You live surrounded by salt water and strict discipline. Then one morning, you wake up and find yourself staring at what seems like paradise. Tahiti was exactly that, a tropical climate, abundant food, friendly people, and a way of life far more comfortable than anything the crew had ever experienced. The hospitality of the local people impressed the sailors deeply. For many of them, this island became the first place where they had ever truly felt happy. At first, the crew was only supposed to stay in Tahiti for a short period of time, but days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and before they even realized it, they had spent more than 6 months on the island. During that time, some crew members formed relationships with the local people. Others began imagining an entirely new life for themselves. The thought of returning to the harsh realities of life at sea became more unbearable with each passing day. Eventually, the mission was completed. It was time to leave. Captain William Bligh gave the order to return home. But by then, most of the men boarding the ship were no longer the same men who had arrived. They had grown accustomed to the comfort of Tahiti. They had experienced paradise, and now it felt as though they were being forced back into hell. At first, nobody openly complained. Orders were obeyed, the sails were raised. The Bounty once again headed into the open ocean, but beneath the surface something was brewing. Most of the crew had no desire to return. At the same time, they were afraid to openly rebel. After all, they were serving under an officer of the Royal Navy. If they were caught committing mutiny, the punishment could very well be death. So for a while they remained silent. But once a person has tasted freedom, it becomes very difficult to return to their old life. That was exactly what the men of the Bounty were experiencing. After seeing the easy life of Tahiti, they no longer wanted to go back to a world filled with orders, punishments, and strict discipline. Eventually, the day everyone remembers arrived. One of the most famous naval mutinies in history began. The man leading it was Fletcher Christian. Ironically, Christian was not an ordinary sailor. He was an officer. For some time, rumors had circulated about tensions between him and Captain Bligh. After leaving Tahiti, those tensions only became worse. Then one day, Christian and the men who supported him decided to act. They entered Captain Bligh's cabin. They overpowered him. They seized control of the ship, and just like that, the mutiny on the Bounty had begun. The mutineers did not kill the captain. Instead, they made a different decision. Captain Bligh and 18 men who remained loyal to him were forced into a small launch. Then they were abandoned in the middle of the ocean and left to their fate. The decision sounds unbelievably cruel. Thousands of kilometers of open sea stretched before them. They carried only a small amount of food, and surviving in such a tiny boat seemed almost impossible. Meanwhile, the mutineers sailed away without even looking back. Their plan was simple: return to Tahiti and spend the rest of their lives there. But there was one thing they had failed to consider. Captain Bligh was not the kind of man who gave up easily. Against all odds, he and his loyal crew managed to survive. And they did much more than simply survive. After an incredible journey of roughly 6,500 kilometers across the open ocean, they finally reached land. To this day, it remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in maritime history. After months of struggle, Captain Bligh finally reached British territory. And from that moment on, only one thing occupied his mind: revenge. He wanted to find the men who had humiliated him, the men who had stolen his ship, the men who had left him to die in the middle of the ocean. No matter what it took, he would find them. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian and his companions still believed they were safe. They had returned to Tahiti. They had gone back to the life they loved. Once again, they were enjoying their tropical paradise. But their happiness would not last long, because somewhere out there in the vast Pacific Ocean, a determined captain was searching for them. Life in Tahiti initially seemed wonderful once again. Christian and his men finally appeared to have everything they wanted. There was no captain barking orders, no harsh discipline, no endless months at sea. For many of them, life had never felt better. Yet despite everything, Fletcher Christian could not escape a single thought. It lingered in the back of his mind day and night. What if Captain Bligh was still alive? At first the idea seemed ridiculous. After all, they had abandoned him in a tiny boat in the middle of the ocean. But as time passed, rumors began to spread, and eventually the news they feared arrived. Bligh had survived. Not only had he survived, but he had made it back to Britain. Even worse, word spread that efforts were already underway to hunt down the mutineers. The news shattered Christian's plans. Tahiti was no longer safe. The British would almost certainly search there first. If they stayed, capture was only a matter of time. So Christian gathered the men he trusted most. He took several Tahitian women and a number of Tahitian men with him. Then they sailed once more into the Pacific. This time they were not searching for paradise. They were searching for a hiding place, a place so remote that the rest of the world would never find them. A place barely visible even on maps. And eventually they found it. Pitcairn Island. Pitcairn Island had a strange history long before Fletcher Christian and his companions arrived. Centuries earlier, Polynesians had lived there, but for reasons that remain unclear, they eventually disappeared. For a very long time the island had been silent, abandoned, forgotten, exactly the kind of place Christian was looking for. In 1790 the group finally settled on the island. At first everything looked promising. The soil was fertile, fresh water was available, the climate was suitable for farming, fish were plentiful. From the outside it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a new beginning, but appearances can be deceiving. Because the problems these people brought with them were far greater than any advantages the island could offer. The total population of the settlement was 27 people, 9 European sailors, 12 Tahitian women, and 6 Tahitian men. At first glance, those numbers may not seem important, but the imbalance they created would become the foundation of nearly every tragedy that followed. Each of the 9 European sailors was given a woman. The remaining 3 women were shared among the 6 Tahitian men. Today that arrangement sounds disturbing, because it was. From the very beginning, it created resentment. The Tahitian men felt humiliated. They were already being treated like servants. Now they were also facing severe inequality in one of the most personal aspects of their lives. Their anger continued to grow with each passing day. But this was only the beginning. The real disaster would come from somewhere else, and its name was alcohol. One of the European settlers, William McCoy, learned how to produce alcohol using local plants. In particular, he discovered how to make liquor from the roots of the tea plant. At first, it was simply a source of entertainment. But over time, things spiraled out of control, especially for McCoy. Before long, he spent most of his days drunk. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian gradually withdrew from daily responsibilities. He wanted to enjoy island life. Rather than managing the settlement, he preferred a quieter existence. As Christian stepped back, McCoy's influence began to grow. But he was not a natural leader. Most of his time was spent drinking. Reasonable decisions gave way to angry ones, and eventually the problems everyone feared began to surface. One day McCoy was drunk once again. He could barely control his temper. A Tahitian woman living with him had failed to catch fish. That was the reason, nothing more. Just that. In a drunken rage he attacked her and tore off her ear. Life on the island was already becoming increasingly difficult. This incident pushed everything over the edge. Unable to endure the humiliation and violence any longer, the woman took her own life by throwing herself from a cliff. The dark era of Pitcairn had officially begun, and the events that followed would permanently change the island's history. McCoy's actions shattered what little balance still existed. The resentment that had been building for years finally reached its breaking point. The Tahitian men, in particular, felt constantly degraded. They worked. They obeyed orders. They were treated as second-class people, and the injustice surrounding the women only intensified their anger. Fletcher Christian and the other Europeans may have been aware of the tension, but they failed to understand how serious the situation had become, until it was too late. One night the Tahitian men gathered together. At first they simply spoke about the unfairness they faced. Then their anger grew. Soon they began discussing revenge. Eventually a decision was made. Enough was enough. They would seize the weapons, they would eliminate the Europeans, and they would take complete control of the island. The plan was far from perfect. In fact, it appeared rushed and poorly organized. But angry people rarely wait for perfect plans. An opportunity presented itself, and they acted. Somehow they gained access to guns and ammunition. What followed was a massacre. Everything happened within a matter of hours. Some sailors were shot before they even understood what was happening. Others tried to flee. Some fought back. But the outcome remained the same. Blood was being spilled, and there was no turning back. One of the first targets was Fletcher Christian himself, the leader of the Bounty Mutiny, the man who had once rebelled against the British Navy, the man who had taken control of his own destiny years earlier. Now he was being destroyed by the very world he had created. Christian was killed during the uprising. Exactly how he died remains uncertain. Some accounts claim he was shot. Others describe different circumstances. But one fact is beyond dispute. The man who had come to Pitcairn searching for a new life was dead, and he was not alone. Many of the European sailors were killed alongside him. Within hours, the balance of power on the island had completely collapsed. The people who once acted as if they owned the island were gone. But the victors would not enjoy their triumph for long. But the victors would not enjoy their success for long, because protecting the women had never really been their goal. Their true objective was to possess them. The Tahitian men believed that once the European sailors were gone, all of the women on the island would belong to them. But they had made a critical mistake. The women were not as powerless as they imagined. In fact, they were the people who had suffered the most from the violence, fear, and oppression that had consumed the island. They knew exactly who these men were. They knew what they were capable of. And after the Europeans were killed, the behavior of the Tahitian men only became worse. The women quickly realized that the new order might be even more dangerous than the previous one. Fear spread throughout the island, and eventually an unexpected alliance formed. The women began secretly speaking among themselves. Together they created a plan, a brutal plan, but a determined one. One night, while the Tahitian men slept, they were attacked, caught completely off guard, at their most vulnerable. One by one they were killed. By the time morning arrived, the island had changed once again. First, the Europeans had killed one another. Then the Tahitian men had killed the Europeans. And now the women had killed the Tahitian men. Within only a few years, Pitcairn Island had become something resembling a graveyard. Out of the original 27 settlers, only a handful remained alive. There were now only a few European men left on the island, along with several women and children. The number of surviving sailors had dropped to just 4. Out of the 9 men who had once rebelled against the British Empire, only 4 remained, but even their story was far from over. because although the violence appeared to have ended, a new chapter was just beginning. In this new chapter, the enemy was no longer hunger. It was no longer rebellion. The enemy was the darkness within people themselves. And over the years ahead, that darkness would continue to consume the remaining inhabitants of Pitcairn, one by one. Among the survivors was one man who would eventually shape the future of the island more than anyone else. John Adams. At the time, nobody could have known it. But years later, nearly every aspect of Pitcairn's history would revolve around him. After the Great Massacre, things finally appeared calm, at least from the outside. The reality was very different. The survivors carried deep scars from everything they had witnessed. They had seen constant death. They had lost friends, spouses, neighbors. Everyone looked at one another with suspicion. Trust had almost completely disappeared. Among the survivors were 4 European men: John Adams, Ned Young, William McCoy, and Matthew Quintal. Alongside them were the Tahitian women and children. At first, some believed peace might finally return. After all, there seemed to be nobody left to fight. But human nature can sometimes be more dangerous than any external threat, especially on a tiny island where escape is nearly impossible. Once again, alcohol became the biggest problem. William McCoy continued producing liquor, and now there was virtually nobody capable of stopping him. He constantly consumed the alcohol he made from the roots of the tea plant. Most of his days were spent intoxicated. At first, people tolerated it. Everyone was dealing with their own struggles. But as time passed, McCoy became increasingly dangerous. When drunk, he grew aggressive. He shouted constantly. He threatened people. And he spread fear throughout the community. The women and children became especially afraid of him. What had once seemed like a man with a drinking problem had become something far worse. Meanwhile, Ned Young was moving in the opposite direction. The years of violence and death had affected him deeply. Many believed he carried tremendous guilt for surviving while so many others had died. As a result, he devoted much of his life to reading the Bible. He prayed. He reflected on his past. And he searched for meaning in everything that had happened. John Adams gradually grew closer to him. The two spent long hours discussing faith, morality, and the mistakes of their past. Matthew Quintal, however, followed a different path entirely. He was neither a drunk like McCoy nor a deeply religious man like Young, but he possessed a volatile temper. He was impatient, and over time he became increasingly difficult to live with. The island looked peaceful on the surface, but beneath that surface everyone carried anger, fear, and trauma. Eventually, the first survivor to fall was William McCoy. Years of alcoholism had finally consumed him. Some accounts claim he was overwhelmed by guilt. Others suggest he had simply lost the will to live. Whatever the reason, one day he climbed to the top of a cliff and threw himself into the sea below. One of the island's greatest problems had disappeared. But that did not mean peace had arrived, because another crisis was already waiting. And this time it centered around Matthew Quintal. Matthew Quintal gradually became more unstable with each passing year. At first his behavior was merely difficult. Then it became dangerous. His temper grew worse. He lashed out at people for no reason. Arguments became more frequent, and before long the women and children on the island were living in fear of him. The most troubling part was that his threats were becoming increasingly serious. Some accounts claim he threatened to kill children. Others suggest he openly talked about harming everyone on the island. Whatever the exact details may have been, one thing was clear. Quintal had become a threat. John Adams and Ned Young found themselves facing an impossible decision. They did not want more bloodshed. The island had already seen enough death. But they also knew they could not allow Quintal to continue. Eventually, they made their choice. One night while Quintal was sleeping, they approached him, and they killed him. Another life had been taken on Pitcairn Island. Perhaps they believed they were protecting the community. Perhaps they felt they had no other option. But regardless of the justification, the result remained the same. Another man was dead. Now, only 2 European men remained on the island, John Adams and Ned Young. Both had changed dramatically from the men they once were. They were no longer the rebellious sailors of their youth. Years of hardship had transformed them, but fate still had more plans for them. Not long afterward, Ned Young became seriously ill. There were no doctors on the island, no medicine, no hospitals, no possibility of proper treatment. Years of stress, fear, isolation, and hardship had taken their toll. And eventually, Young died. John Adams was now completely alone, at least among the men, because he had become the only adult male left on the island. Think about that for a moment. Years earlier, 27 people had arrived on Pitcairn. Now only one adult man remained, and that was John Adams. This marked the beginning of one of the most unusual periods in the island's history. Because Adams was no longer just a survivor, he became a teacher, a leader, a judge, a preacher, and ultimately, the man who would shape the future of the island. Every child born on Pitcairn would grow up within the system he created. The fate of the entire community now rested in the hands of a single person. John Adams was the last adult man on the island. Had someone predicted this years earlier, nobody would have believed it. A place that had once been home to dozens of people now depended entirely on one individual. What made the situation even more remarkable was Adams' past. He had once been a mutineer, a man who had rebelled against the Royal Navy, a man who had participated in some of the bloodiest events in the island's history, a man who had watched friends die around him. Yet over the years, Adams himself had changed. Much of that change was influenced by Ned Young. Before his death, Young had left behind a Bible and the religious teachings that had become so important to him. Those teachings profoundly affected Adams. The man he had once been seemed to disappear, at least in his own eyes. Determined to spend the rest of his life seeking redemption, Adams dedicated himself to the community. He began educating the children. He taught them how to read. He read passages from the Bible. He taught them how to pray. He spoke about morality and proper conduct. And over time, he became much more than an ordinary man in their eyes. He became an authority figure. The entire structure of life on the island gradually began to revolve around him. On one side were the women, on the other were the growing children. And at the center of everything stood John Adams. As the years passed, the population slowly increased. Children grew into adults. New children were born. The community expanded. Yet despite all of this, they remained completely isolated from the outside world. Many of the younger generations had never seen another society. For them, Pitcairn Island was the entire world. Meanwhile, Adams increasingly occupied a unique position within that world. Some historians believe he genuinely wanted to create a better society. Others argue that years of absolute authority changed him. Regardless of interpretation, one fact remains undeniable. Everyone listened to him. He established the rules. He provided the education. He settled disputes. In many ways, he had become the island's leader, teacher, judge, and preacher all at once. Years passed. Children became adults. New generations emerged. And for a time, it seemed as though Pitcairn had finally left its bloody past behind. But the rest of the world had not completely forgotten about them. Then, in 1808, a ship appeared on the horizon, and everything changed once again. The appearance of a ship on the horizon in 1808 marked a turning point in the history of Pitcairn Island. For years, the people living there had been almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. Many of the children had never seen outsiders before. Some had never even imagined that other societies existed beyond the endless ocean surrounding them. As the ship approached, curiosity spread throughout the island. No one knew what to expect. The visitors, however, were equally unprepared for what they were about to find. The sailors aboard the ship expected to discover something entirely different. Perhaps a group of dangerous criminals. Perhaps descendants of mutineers living in chaos. Perhaps a violent settlement struggling to survive. Instead, they found a functioning community. The homes were organized, the children were educated, the people spoke English, and at the center of it all stood John Adams. The visitors were astonished. Years earlier, Adams had been one of the men involved in the Bounty Mutiny, a criminal in the eyes of the British Empire, a fugitive who should have faced punishment. Yet the man standing before them hardly resembled the rebellious sailor described in official records. He appeared calm, respected, responsible, and deeply religious. The children treated him as a teacher. The women viewed him as a leader. The community itself seemed stable. This was not what anyone had expected. Under normal circumstances, Adams could have been arrested immediately. After all, his participation in the mutiny was no secret. But circumstances had changed. The mutiny had taken place many years earlier. Most of the men involved were long dead, and the island that had emerged from those events now revolved entirely around Adams. The British visitors ultimately decided not to take action against him. They left him where he was. And Pitcairn continued its unusual existence. Perhaps this is one of the strangest twists in the entire story. A man who had once rebelled against the British Empire ended up spending the final years of his life as the respected leader of a small island community. But the story was far from over, because after Adams eventually died, Pitcairn entered another new chapter. The island slowly became more connected to the outside world. Ships arrived more frequently. Visitors came and went. News from distant countries reached the island. And along with those visitors came new opportunities, new ideas, and new problems. As time passed, more people learned about Pitcairn. The story of the Bounty Mutineers fascinated explorers, historians, and adventurers alike. Many wanted to see the island for themselves. Some arrived out of genuine curiosity. Others hoped to help the community, and a few saw opportunities for power and influence. One of those individuals was a man named George Noble. For a period of time, he became an influential figure within the community, but like many others who would follow, his influence did not last forever. Then another man arrived, a man whose story would become one of the strangest episodes in Pitcairn's history. His name was Joshua Hill. When Hill arrived, he claimed to be an official representative of the British Crown. He told the islanders that he had been sent to govern the island on behalf of Britain. Many people believed him. After all, most of the island's residents had little knowledge of how the British government actually operated. They had no practical way to verify his claims, and so Joshua Hill quickly gained authority. At first he promised stability, order, prosperity, a stronger future for Pitcairn. But over time, his behavior began to change. He became increasingly authoritarian. He imposed his own rules. He expected obedience. And he did not tolerate criticism. Eventually, many islanders became suspicious. Then the truth emerged. Joshua Hill was not what he claimed to be. He had never been officially appointed by the British Crown. Much of the authority he claimed was based on deception. Once this became known, his reputation collapsed. The people turned against him, and eventually he was forced to leave the island. Pitcairn had once again survived a leadership crisis. By this point, however, the islanders had learned valuable lessons from their past. They were no longer as easily manipulated as before. Still, another major transformation was approaching, and this time it would arrive not through politics or adventure, but through religion. Toward the end of the 19th century, representatives of the Seventh-day Adventist Church arrived on Pitcairn. Their teachings were based on Christianity, but they followed traditions and practices that differed from those already familiar to the islanders. Surprisingly, many residents embraced these new beliefs. Over time, a large portion of the population adopted the Adventist faith. New religious practices began influencing daily life. Changes appeared in diet. Changes appeared in customs. Changes appeared in the way people organized their society. One of the most unusual examples involved pigs. The new religious leaders argued that the pigs on the island should be removed. Many residents found the idea strange at first, yet eventually most accepted it. And little by little, Pitcairn continued evolving into something entirely different from the settlement established by the Bounty mutineers. It was no longer simply the island of the mutiny. It had become a unique society with its own traditions, beliefs, and identity. And as the 19th century drew to a close, Pitcairn moved steadily toward the modern world. By the early 20th century, Pitcairn was no longer a completely isolated island cut off from the rest of the world. Over the years, its relationship with Britain had grown stronger. Government officials occasionally visited. Administrative institutions were gradually established, and the island slowly became more connected to the modern world. Its population remained extremely small. Yet Pitcairn was no longer just a remote settlement made up of a handful of families. Post offices were established. Official postage stamps were printed. Postcards were sent across the globe. People from different countries became fascinated by the story of the Bounty mutineers and wanted to visit the island for themselves. Gradually, Pitcairn became a destination for curious travelers. Visitors were willing to cross vast stretches of ocean simply to see one of the most isolated communities on Earth. As this happened, the island's administration also became more modern. Municipal systems were introduced, courts were established, healthcare services improved, official government representatives were appointed. From the outside, everything appeared normal. In fact, many people believed that Pitcairn had finally left its dark past behind. But reality was far more complicated. Some of the problems that had existed within the community for generations had never truly disappeared. Instead, they remained hidden beneath the surface. And in the early 2000s, those problems erupted into one of the biggest scandals in the island's history. In 2004, Pitcairn became the focus of international attention. At the time, the island's population was only around 50 people. Yet, allegations emerged that shocked the world. Multiple men were investigated for crimes involving child abuse and sexual offenses. Dozens of charges were brought forward. What made the situation even more shocking was the identity of some of the accused. Among them were not only ordinary residents, there were also prominent members of the community, local officials, community leaders, people who had long been regarded as respectable figures on the island. The scandal created enormous controversy, not only for Pitcairn itself, but also for the British authorities responsible for governing the territory. Because in such a tiny community, accusations of this magnitude attracted worldwide media attention. Eventually, the cases went to court. Some individuals were found guilty. Several received prison sentences. For the first time in the island's history, serious prison facilities had to be established. Think about how unusual that is. An island with only a few dozen residents needed a prison. That fact alone demonstrates how extraordinary the situation had become. Yet even after the trials ended, the controversies did not completely disappear. In 2010, another scandal emerged. This time the focus was a local official known for advocating children's rights. Authorities reportedly discovered illegal material on his computer. Following an investigation, he was sentenced to prison. The incident dealt another major blow to the island's reputation. When you look at Pitcairn's history as a whole, a strange pattern begins to emerge. From the very beginning, the island seemed unable to escape controversy. Mutinies, murders, civil conflicts, power struggles, scandals, and endless disputes. It almost feels as though this tiny island has spent centuries fighting against its own demons. Over the years, leadership continued to change. Eventually, Pitcairn elected its first female mayor. Many people viewed this as a positive step forward. Later, other leaders took office as well, and the island continued adapting to the modern era. Today, Pitcairn remains one of Britain's overseas territories, yet its population is still remarkably small. Recent estimates place the number of residents at roughly 50 people. Yes, only about 50. There are apartment buildings in many cities that house more people than an entire island nation-sized community like Pitcairn. Most of the people living there today are descendants of the Bounty mutineers and the generations that followed them. In other words, the story of Fletcher Christian and his companions never truly ended. The choices they made, the mistakes they committed, and the society they created continue to shape life on the island centuries later. Personally, that was one of the most surprising aspects of this story. What began as a naval mutiny eventually led to the creation of one of the most unusual communities on Earth. But at the same time, this story teaches us something important. People can travel to the most remote corner of the planet. They can escape governments. They can escape cities. They can escape entire civilizations. But escaping human nature is much more difficult, and perhaps Pitcairn's history is one of the clearest examples of that reality. A tiny island in the middle of the ocean, a place so remote that many people have never even heard of it. Yet within its history are stories of betrayal, love, rebellion, murder, faith, power, survival, and generations of people struggling to build a life in one of the most isolated places on Earth. And that, in simple terms, is the story of Pitcairn Island. Hopefully, the island's future will be defined not by the darkness that marked so much of its past, but by something far more hopeful. Because honestly, the sheer number of extraordinary events that took place in such a small place is almost impossible to believe. See you in the next story.